You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, and even a little bit of news and gossip with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today, we're doing an old-fashioned movie roundtable. And now, here's Steve.
Guys, welcome Lee, welcome Richard, welcome Avi to our movie roundtable. It's the first time we're getting a whole group of people to talk just our love of movies and where that comes from, where it's going, where it's been. So many parameters there. I'm going to start with the very first question. What was the first movie that you saw as a kid that convinced you that I've got to see more movies? This is really a lot of fun.
Who are you asking, Steve?
I'm asking the group, but I'll start with you, Arthur.
Well, I would prefer to hear. Actually, I'll start with Lee. Lee, what do you think?
Jason and the Argonauts scared me so much that I had to run to the lobby to get away from Talos, the bronze statue. Of course, I went back to see the film 3 more times.
How old were you, Lee?
I was 7 years old.
Oh, boy.
I love that film.
That is a marvelous movie. That, of course, is Ray Harryhausen, the special effects maestro at his very best. And, of course, you have the wonderful Bernard Herrmann providing that wonderful score.
Unforgettable. In fact, that's why I think I responded to the Hitchcock films later, that I saw later in life, so intensely, because I recognized the musical stylings of Bernard Herrmann.
I think the movie that scared me so that my grandmother had to take me out of the theater since I was disturbing everyone was when they shot Bambi. I don't know what the hell Walt Disney was thinking to shoot the mother in a cartoon.
They didn't shoot Bambi. They shot Bambi's mother.
That's what didn't I just say that?
No, you said they shot Bambi. You can't shoot Bambi.
I'm going to shoot myself.
However, there was a short film called Bambi Meets Godzilla.
Great. That's a great one.
There was also a soft porn film, Bambi Schwartz versus somebody.
No, I think Bambi was the lead in Debbie Does Dallas.
Yes.
That's true. And
but
look how far
we were too young for that.
Look how far we've stretched. We've gone from Bambi to Debbie Does Dallas. Now that's a range. Richard, what movie comes to mind when you think about those first experiences that stands out?
Well, gentlemen, you're going to think it's kind of interesting I'm picking this one because there's so many to pick from that stand out when you're a child. But I'd have to go with The Blob because that was just a terrific movie, and I believe it was in 3D when it came out originally, and it was just something with Steve McQueen, I believe. It just had such an impact, especially if you're at the drive-in movie theater or something like that, you know. And I just thought it was just such a terrific return to a time that just impacted you, especially around Halloween.
Richard, where were you when you saw that? What city?
I like to say Fort Lauderdale.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that movie was a surprise hit for Paramount that year. It was one of the wave of science fiction independent, although this was a Paramount release. It was, first of all, the credit read starring Stephen McQueen, which I thought was interesting. The producer actually tried to call the movie The Glob with a G, but that title was taken, so they went with The Blob. What was Johnny Carson's sidekick's name?
Ed McMahon.
Ed McMahon actually is featured in the movie, the voice of the horror movie that's playing in the theater in the Blob Town. And Burt Bacharach actually helped compose the song by the 5 Blobs, which was actually only one blob. He was just overtracked 5 times.
Actually, the producer of that was a guy named Jack H. Harris.
Yes.
He was an exhibitor, and this was his first movie, and he lived in Malibu, and I think he told me that was the house that the Blob built.
Absolutely. And blobs have continued. There have been a couple of remakes. Richard, you picked a good one. It's actually one of my favorites, and it plays very well today.
And it's on the Criterion. It is part of the Criterion collection.
Yes.
And I watched it the other night in a pristine print. Olin Howland is in the movie. He plays the old man who first finds the little meteorite, which attaches itself to him in the blob. The reason I mention Olin Howland, because the movie I was going to mention that had an impact on me the first time was the movie Them, 1954. I saw it much later at a Saturday morning kiddie matinee about the giant ants in the New Mexico desert. And later they track the ants to Los Angeles, and they find a alcoholic who played by Olin Howland, the old man who was later in Blob.
Another film I love.
Avi, what is the film that had a profound impact on you when you were a kid?
Well, the first film I ever saw was Bambi. I mean, I remember it quite clearly. I think I was 2. And which aligns with Disney would re-release their classic films every 7 years. So it aligns when I was 2.
Did you say you were 2 years old and you remember it?
Yeah.
Is that possible?
And I also had a Bambi picture book, which my parents bought me. But the film, the most important film is 2001: A Space Odyssey. I started tracking its production when I was about 12, 1966. It was the first film that I realized that movies, people actually made movies, that it was like a job that people had, and they went out and they did this. Because before that, I think for a lot of people, for a lot of kids, movies are just there. And nowadays it's different because everybody knows how movies are made, and there's so much information out there for, bonus materials on Blu-rays and whatever. I mean, everybody knows about movie making, but back then, people, kids especially, movies are just there. They're just part of the landscape, and you went to see a movie, and it's kind of like, your parents provide the food you eat. I mean, you don't think about it. It's just there. And 2001 changed everything.
Well, I couldn't avoid the whole process because I lived across the street from a movie theater for 6 years. So all I had to do was fall out of bed, and I was at Fox West Coast Stadium Theater on Pico Boulevard in West LA. Saturday mornings, there'd be 2 films, plus a cartoon, plus the coming attractions, popcorn for a quarter, Coke for a dime, admission 35 cents.
Well, my father, he managed theaters. So some of my earliest memories are going to his, he managed, I was too young when he managed hardtop theaters in Boston, but he started managing drive-ins in Hartford, Connecticut, and in Westchester County, New York. All that stuff you just mentioned I got for free, but, it was, we didn't, because it was a drive-in, I had to go with my parents, with my mom. So it wasn't as often as you being able to just walk across the street.
Arthur, you're the big man in exhibition here. Did you ever own a drive-in?
Oh, yeah. We owned or leased a couple of drive-in theaters. Different world, different kind of business. But I want to go back to this question of movies that made profound impacts. In my particular case, as I've mentioned before on this show, when we were a kid in the Bronx in the late 40s, we would go to the theaters like yourself, Steve, and everybody else, and see cartoons and chapter series and all this stuff. But what we would see the matinee of whatever was playing in the theater. It could have been whatever, Gone with the Wind or Red River or in our case, we saw Snake Pit. And we're 7, 8 years old. And think of this. Now, mind you, there were no ratings. No, you didn't know what you're going to see. I would go with my 6 friends or so. And after the experience of Snake Pit, which was a horrendous experience, I had a friend called Burton, and every time we go to the movies, he'd always say as we were walking to the movies, I hope they're playing something good today, considering the fact that we were terrified by seeing that kind of a movie. We also saw Lost Weekend. You talk about profound impact for kids. But again, there were no ratings, and you paid your 25 cents or whatever it was, and you went in and saw these things. Years later, of course, there were ratings, and kids couldn't see pictures like that.
One of the things I think we should talk about, one of the areas, is not really being made today, but all of us were affected by it, were the musicals. I mean, they were fantastic musicals made as we were, many of us growing up, and even if you weren't growing up, you saw them on television. I don't think that, La La Land, God bless them all, but, we're talking about Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, or we're talking about Singing in the Rain, or we're talking about The Wizard of Oz. We're talking about great musicals that were being made. How about any of you guys? What did you guys love in musicals?
Well,
I'll go. This is Richard. I love Grease. I think Grease was just something that really America needed during that time to kind of go back to the way things were and need to be. And I think during that time period when it came out in the 70s, I think a lot of people missed that about our generation, post Kennedy. And I think it's really nice to have Grease because it's always something that when you watch that movie, you don't just appreciate the musical, but you also appreciate the feeling you get because you feel like you're back in high school with the T-Birds. It's just a really impactful film that I think it's ageless. Also,
Richard, if I can say, Grease was a great movie.
Yes.
It was a great, fun, entertaining movie for anybody.
And a great play. And a great play, I believe, before it became a movie.
You also get
a big hit Broadway show.
And the history of who was in that show started with Barry Bostwick, but John Travolta was in it, Richard Gere was in it. This is all on Broadway before the movie was made.
Well, the 1960s was a decade of epic musicals. I mean, musicals were like everything else, like costume. It was just like it was on a scale that films really had not. That kind of film had never really been made before. Apart from the fact that my cousin's company made a couple of really big ones like West Side Story and Fiddler on the Roof. I think the greatest musical ever made is great, not because it's a musical, but because it's one of the greatest comedies ever made, and that's Singing in the Rain. It is a film that still is. I mean, I can see some of my favorite film comedies, and I'll smile because I know where all the gags are. Singing in the Rain, for whatever reason, is about the only film where I can see it over and over again and still laugh out loud. There's something about that film.
Peter Bogdanovich used to do a morning video show on one of the morning shows, and he did a whole day. Did a whole segment on Gene Kelly, and he refers to Singing in the Rain as the most ebullient musical ever, a feel-good musical that will never die. And I agree. I mean, when I taught PR at UCLA Extension, I would always play the first 10 minutes of Singing in the Rain. Because if you'll recall, one of the people on the stage after Lena and Don Locke take their bows, they're greeted by the publicist, and I had to introduce what a publicist does.
Dignity, always dignity.
And like several other movies, big movies of all time, Singing in the Rain, when it opened, was not a hit at the box office.
Arthur, how is that possible?
It's what happened. The Wonderful Life, same thing. Wizard of Oz, the same thing. These things took life from television.
That's crazy. Well, go ahead, Lee.
I will say that Wizard of Oz, for people of my generation, were the ones that was the film that introduced us to the musical, and unforgettably so, and memorably so. And the only thing, because it was on TV starting in the late 50s, I think, every year. Yes. And when my family got a color TV in the mid 1960s, being able to realize that once you entered Munchkinland, you entered a world of color from the sepia tone black and white, that was a formative experience. But I will go back to Singing in the Rain. Is there a more perfect film? I think not. I don't think there's a movie that's perfect.
It is for me. The only other movie that shocked me as a kid was to see Public Enemy #1 dancing, to see James Cagney, Yankee Doodle Dandy, dancing. It was so shocking, having been kind of brought up on the movie of the gangster movie.
And Julian dancing like no one ever danced before him or after him. He had a style that was completely original.
Yeah.
Well, Cagney's dancing was modeled on George M. Cohan's. I mean, it was not Cagney's style of dancing; it was Cohan's.
Well, we didn't see Cohan dancing, So we saw Cagney as the movie star. But I understand, George M. Cohan is Yankee Doodle Dandy. We get that.
So we've been talking about our positive first experiences. Here I'll throw you a different kind of question. Have you ever walked out of a movie that was just so bad that you just couldn't stand it anymore? I'll start with Julian.
Remember, I spent my many years as an exhibitor looking at movies before they were released. Now, you guys those who are not in the business, go to see movies and walk out, but enough people thought that movie was good enough to release. I would see movies that wouldn't even escape. They were just awful. And so, yes, I mean, I often would go out to California to look at movies that were available for distribution, and I would line up 8 or 10 movies in a screening room and say to the projectionist, take this off, take this one off, take it off, because they were just awful.
Isn't that the same thing they say in strip parlors?
Well, that's a whole other story. Yes, Steve.
But the better part of that question is major movies, expensive movies that you've seen in a movie theater and walked out of. Like some people would have said that with don't hit me, guys, Apocalypse Now. A lot of people were turned off by it and walked and left. I saw in Nashville, sitting next to Robert Altman at a director sneak preview in Boston, and half the audience walked out on Nashville. So that to me is a kind of a more interesting question. What got out there that was kind of like supposed to be big and just didn't work?
Well, I'll tell you, one movie was called The Adventurers. And Gene Shalit reviewed it by saying, The Adventurers is a mammoth movie, and that's why the mammoths are extinct.
Yeah.
My favorite Gene Shalit capsule review was of my cousin's film, Midway, about the Battle of Midway in 1976. And Shalit said, Midway isn't the best war film ever made, and it's not the worst. Maybe that's why they called it Midway.
Hey.
I find it interesting that most of the movies we're talking about that people have walked out of are long movies, which I think is part of the problem with movies today. They're just too damn long.
We were just talking.
Brutalist, which I just read about today, is 3 hours and 36 minutes long.
Which one, Lee?
The Brutalist.
But Lee, I heard that it comes with an intermission.
It comes with an intermission.
How about that? They're thinking of the bladders.
But at least they've given you the idea that it's brutal.
There you go.
Exactly.
Oh,
Anybody ever see a movie called The Agony and the Ecstasy?
Yes.
Oh yeah, I know the film very well.
Did you sit through that whole film?
Yeah, I have. I think it's a pretty good movie. It's a little self-important, but a lot of movies are.
But it's got a great score by Alex North. That's one of the things that I loved about it.
I remember asking a friend of mine, because the movies used to open only downtown in New York, and not in the suburbs at all for a while, sometimes a year. And I said, what did you think of Ben-Hur? He said, I only saw Ben.
Hey. I was talking to Richard the other day and asked him a question that we can go around with. And he had a great answer, and that is, name me a movie that you think was great, but that kind of was overlooked. And one of these really little gems, and it was by Clint Eastwood. And Richard, what was your response?
Play Misty for me.
There you go. Play Misty for me.
Yep.
Great sleeper. Tell us about your experience with that picture, Rich. Scare you?
I was very surprised about it because at the time, Clint Eastwood, he was such into Westerns, and it was his first directorial debut. I was really impressed with it because I just was surprised to see that kind of a thriller, on your edge of your seat thriller, because it just kind of, I believe at the time, it has to be the first kind of Fatal Attraction prequel, because you have somebody that gets into a relationship that basically thinks, well, this woman's pretty attractive. I'm meeting her at the bar, and she's waiting for a guy. I'm here. I'm a radio disc jockey kind of guy. And then he kind of gets involved in a Fatal Attraction like situation. And I think at the time, it probably terrified a lot of men, and it was unique in that kind of situation. And I really love the fact that I think it was Clint Eastwood's first directorial debut, I believe.
It was.
Yeah, and it was, and I was telling Arthur, I think if his name was Hitchcock instead of Eastwood, it would have been a huge hit. I actually liked the way that the picture was, because it kind of took you in a lot of different directions from the scenes throughout the film, and how it kind of just kind of guided you through, because you basically are the eyes of this guy, kind of like, how would you deal with this kind of situation, having this beautiful woman after you. And I just think that it's a very impactful picture, because it kind of molded, I believe, a lot of movie producers and directors.
And Richard, the ever-present great song by Errol Garner, "Play Misty for Me."
Yeah, which is still a fantastic song. It's ageless. It's just a timeless song, and it's just a great film.
May I add that what's amazing about that movie is that it's the first movie that Clint Eastwood, like we said, directed. And 53 years later, he's still directing.
Amazing.
I saw Juror number 2 last night.
How was it, Lee?
Terrific film. It's a terrific film.
Yeah, it's really
Where'd you see it?
I saw it through a friend's server.
Yeah.
It's coming. It'll be on Max starting December 20th.
Okay.
So everybody can see it then, because it's not in the theaters for too long a story to talk about why Warner Brothers kind of dumped it.
As you say, I mean, Eastwood is 74. Martin Scorsese is 83. I think Spielberg is 78. And if someone grabbed me off the street and said, "You're going to direct this movie," I'd have to go into a gym for 6 months just to build up the stamina to do it, so I wouldn't fall asleep in the director's chair like Louis Milestone on the set of Mutiny on the Bounty. And so I don't know how Spielberg and Scorsese and Eastwood do it. I mean, I guess it's just the muscles are built in by this time, and they
Don't forget Woody Allen.
Get it done. Well, yeah.
Avi, excuse me, but did you say Clint Eastwood was how old?
94.
94, yes.
94, yeah, you had said 74, I think.
Yeah, I thought he said 74.
Oh, sorry.
Getting back to the stinkers, I have to tell you the story of my worst experience in the movie theater. I went to the Cinerama Dome in Hollywood for a sneak preview. And you guys remember when sneak previews were things where you didn't know what it was going to be, real potluck. You didn't know what you were going to get. And I got to see, for the first few minutes, a Russian movie featuring talking circus animals, but dubbed. And you got to picture this, dubbed in English, talking circus animals. It's the only time in my life that literally the whole audience, not one person, stayed in that theater. We all got up and left after 10 minutes. It was a true debacle.
Well, it was probably during the Cold War, Steve.
Yeah, it was a sneak attack from the Russians, and it worked.
Do you remember who the distributor was? I'm just curious.
I have no idea.
Kamikaze Films?
I don't know, Arthur.
Ever see a movie called Lord Love a Duck?
I've heard of that. Is that Buddy Hackett?
No.
Roddy McDowell. Yeah.
George Axel.
You don't walk out of that, you run out of it.
But
I'll tell you a movie that did no business and is a brilliant movie. And it's so actually apropos of today's world. And that's Billy Wilder's Ace in the Hole.
One of my favorites.
One of the great movies, and all about the media and what the media does and how it manipulates, et cetera, et cetera. But what a film. And Arthur, you had an experience where you met Wilder, didn't you?
I did. And he did say, I met him when he was about 90 at Kate Mantalini's on Wilshire Boulevard. And we had a nice conversation. And he told me that was the one movie in his little German accent at the time, It Got Away. That was the one movie he felt that one of his great works of art that got away in terms of box office. What a movie. Do we all agree on that, by the way?
Yeah, it's a tough movie. It's a really tough movie.
Tough to watch, yeah.
It brings to mind, Wilder made a film of his second film he ever directed is called Five Graves to Cairo, and it's a particular favorite of mine.
Me too.
Eric von Stroheim plays Field Marshal Rommel, and Stroheim had been a hero. Wilder had admired Stroheim for decades, and they're on the set one day, and Wilder says to Stroheim, "You are always 10 years ahead of your time," and then without cracking a smile, Stroheim said, 20, Mr. Wilder, 20.
Yeah.
But the thing is about Ace in the Hole is it was way ahead of its time. Yes. It was just the wrong time for that movie. Audiences were not ready for it.
It may be the most cynical movie I've ever seen. I
agree. I think you hit it exactly on the nail on the head.
Another film like that, which did not do any business, was a movie of Face in the Crowd. Another film that really showed what the power of television could do and the danger of the power of television. Face in the Crowd, Andy Griffith, unbelievable.
One of the greatest movies I've ever seen, Julian. Really. What a movie. It should be seen today by everybody.
And you have to ask yourself, if there had never been a Face in the Crowd, would there ever have been a network?
That's true. That's absolutely true.
Or a line between the two of them.
I asked Kazan, because I love the movie, and he gave it to me, and I distributed it for 30 years. But I asked him about Griffith, and was he happy with everything that happened? And he said the only thing he was unhappy with was the last scene where Griffith is drunk. And he said he couldn't get Griffith to do the scene right. So as he's put it, he said, I took him to the Jack Daniels School of Acting.
Well, a movie of that ilk that was very successful and is in my heavy rotation because every time I come across it in streaming, I'll stop, is Peter Weir's The Truman Show, which is just really a delightful movie. Any thoughts on that one?
Excuse me, I have no thoughts on The Truman Show. Forgive me, Steve. But I want to go back to the network. You know, if you see Network today, which was released in 1976, I believe.
It lost to Rocky that year for the Best Picture.
That film is about as prophetic about the future as anything one could see. Lee, you would agree?
Absolutely. It's like a documentary.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it was really something. And I was lucky enough to have Peter Finch on my show. And he was just terrific to talk to and talked a lot about that film and mostly how afraid he was to do it. But he turned in one hell of a performance.
How about Ned Beatty's performance in that movie, Julian?
Oh, Ned Beatty. Oh. Everybody. Yeah. Holden and Beatrice Straight. I think she's on for 7 or 8 minutes and gets nominated for the Academy Award.
I think she wins.
She wins.
It's one of the only 2 films to ever have 3 Oscar-winning actors in the one film.
Finch, Beatrice Straight,
and Faye Dunaway.
And Faye Dunaway, she was great. Yeah.
What a movie! They told her she didn't want to play it that tough, and they really got on her, Chayefsky, and they really wanted her to play it that tough, and of course she eventually did.
When you get into films like those, you need to mention All the King's Men as well, with Broderick Crawford, early 1950s maybe. What a movie.
1949.
Try and get that made today. Wow.
Yeah. Well, that was really, the films that we're talking about had scripts, that were literate, intelligent, sophisticated, and it had something to do with the society we lived in. I'm afraid.
A lot of it has to do, though, with having a studio that's willing to take a chance. In Columbia and All the King's Men, just an example, Harry Cohn, for all his faults as a human being, was willing to go out on a limb and make a film that might not make many money, but would be a hell of a movie.
It's funny because as a Turner Classic Movies watcher, as I know Avi is, and I know some of you are, there have been a lot of classic films over the years. My question is, does Hollywood still make classics? Because it seems like fewer and fewer films each year.
The answer is no.
Yeah, movies I would want to see. I mean, we used to collect movies. We were delighted when the DVDs or the VHSs came out because we could own them. I haven't bought a movie that I wanted to own in years.
Well, I think that, as we say, is the paucity of the product that's being put out. It's not being made for adults. It's made for young boys, young kids, and it's a totally different world. Every once in a while, something sneaks through. But those of us who loved something like Kramer versus Kramer, nothing even coming close to that. these days.
In
And you take a great filmmaker, excuse me, you take a great filmmaker like Scorsese, and he is now having his film shown on Netflix or one of these streaming services, and they're running, forget the running time, they're costing $200 million for Scorsese to make a movie, which is like a loss leader maybe for the streamer, but it's a disaster for the financiers. You know, it's just one of those things.
Well, it's a different dynamic now. Unlike the studios, which have to show a profit so they can pay their thousands of employees and their distribution systems and their marketing teams, the streamers, they don't have to worry about box office. They want to get people to subscribe to their service. And look what's happening with Netflix and Amazon and Apple. They're getting millions of subscribers. I mean, Netflix, they make more money in 1 month than most of these studios make all year.
Well, did you see the staggering number that Netflix got from the fight of Mike Tyson, 51 years old, 78 million viewers for a Mike Tyson fight against a younger guy who's maybe 35?
Yeah,
it's an event.
But
who won, Arthur? Who won?
It wasn't Mike Tyson.
It wasn't Tyson. It was the other guy. But holy care. It was terrible. I understand it was so flat and boring, and it continues to play. People continue to choose to watch. It's an event. It became something.
But you saw it, Arthur, right? You watched it.
No, I couldn't. No.
You didn't watch it. Okay.
He wasn't one of the 70 million. Avi, you were about to say something.
Yeah, streaming services have a guaranteed cash flow every month. And at the same time, they have much less in overhead than a traditional studio. They don't have a physical plant to take care of it. They have relatively few employees, so they can afford to put money into properties and actual filming, and it goes where it's supposed to. It ends up on screen.
Okay, I'm going to ask another pointed question, and it's one I get asked frequently. Somehow you've done something terrible and you're banished to a desert island where you're only allowed to have one form of entertainment. You can bring one movie with you, which will be your movie you'll be watching for the rest of your life. And you're never going to get tired of it because you love it. So what is that movie, Julian?
I'm going to kill myself. I'm not going to sit there with one movie. I'm a dead man, and it's certainly not going to be The Adventurers. But anyhow, I don't know, Steve. One movie. I tell you a film that I just adore. It's not the only film. There's so many that you can think of, but I really love Hitchcock's movie Notorious. I just found this to be such an incredible movie with Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman and the great Claude Rains. But I guess if I had to take one movie, I'd have to take Casablanca, because to me, it's the perfect movie.
Richard, what about yourself?
Well, it's a hard choice because for an avid movie lover as myself, I have to go with a combination of things. The actual, the way the movie is filmed, the intent of the director, what the producers were thinking, but foremost, music in the film and the action. And I have to say, Goodfellas would be my choice.
Ooh.
Yes.
Great choice.
It's an amazing choice. There's so many scenes to talk about. They're just so impactful, especially the long, the shot that comes to mind in particular is when Henry Hill takes his new girl out on the first date, and the long shot that's never cut going to the performance of the dinner there. And it's an amazing shot to watch because
Scorsese at his best. Yeah,
yes,
really.
It's never cut, and it's so amazing to watch because when you watch that scene, to get that perfect like that was amazing. And if
you take out 4-letter words, there's no script.
Lee, what about you, Lee? What would be the film you're taking to Steve's Desert Island?
It's a movie that I've seen more times than I can count. It's Touch of Evil. So I figure if I've seen it enough times.
Ooh.
This is Orson Welles. It's also related to using the camera in a brilliant manner. The first shot is 3.5 minutes long. There's an interrogation scene that goes on for like almost an entire reel. And it's just great acting, great photography, great performances, everything about it is really good.
And one of the worst re-edits with the changing where the music went. The original had Henry Mancini's opening that perfectly works with the opening, and then they just...
I have to agree with you, Steve. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, just bad. Stick with the original. Well, my movie has never changed. It's always going to be John Sturgis's 1963 prisoner of war epic, The Great Escape. I've done 3...
That's what you would try to do if you were on that island.
Not a James Bond movie, Steve?
Well, I probably would put Goldfinger in the mix, but I was trying not to be a cliche.
Well, for me, first I have to say it wouldn't be Castaway. Otherwise Tom Hanks and I would be competing for the volleyball's attention. But for me, it'd probably be Patton.
Patton, yeah.
I think it's another nearly perfect movie, and it's just I'd never get tired of it.
That would be one of mine.
I think I've told this before, but I got to know George C. Scott rather well, and I asked him, knowing the answer was going to be Patton, what his favorite movie was, and he said Dr. Strangelove.
Well, the thing about Strangelove is Kubrick wanted him to play it differently from the way he did, the way he wanted to play it, and especially the scenes in the war room. And Kubrick basically told Scott that they were doing a rehearsal and just play it as floridly as you can and just see what. But he had the cameras running, and that's what he used. And Scott steals the movie. I mean, with Sellers in 3 roles and Keenan Wynn and Sterling Hayden. But Scott is really whom you remember. I mean, Scott is just so brilliant.
I kind of mostly remember Peter Sellers in that movie, but yes, all 4 parts of it.
All 3 roles.
Yes. Steve, I got to tell you, Steve, Buddy Hackett, not talking about movie, Buddy Hackett once said if he was on an island alone with Beatrice Arthur, he would head for a tree. That's what he said. That's what he said, guys. My favorite movie of all time that would be on that island with me would be Bridge on the River Kwai. I would say I've never seen a better film.
It's a true classic.
David Lean.
Absolutely.
Avi, how great was it, David Lean, in your opinion?
I may be the only one here who actually had a chat with David Lean, but he's a fascinating director because he's not really. To me, directors they're different categories of directors. There are writer-directors like Billy Wilder, and then there are directors who are pure directors like Lean, and there are directors for hire, who did what the studio handed them, like Michael Curtiz. And they're all great, but they had their, they overlapped to what they could do. But Lean was, he could marshal the forces of movie making and make a film that was, indisputably his. I mean, you look at David Lean. When Richard Attenborough made Gandhi, he kind of looked like a David Lean movie, and I think that's where a lot of its cachet came from. But you look at it a little bit more closely, and it's not a David Lean movie. I mean, Lean would not have made that movie that way.
I think a lot of these types of directors, the epic directors, owe a nod to Cecil B. DeMille. I think DeMille was a filmmaker who filmed for the whole screen. He wasn't what I consider to be an intimate director, but boy, if he wanted to do spectacle, he was a true spectacle meister.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, DeMille has fascinated me ever since I read his autobiography when I was in college, and he certainly knew where to put the camera. I don't think he ever quite got the hang of talking pictures. There's still a lot of the conventions of silent cinema in his talking films. The 10 Commandments will get its brickbats, but it is still 4 hours of pure entertainment. I mean, it was every Easter in my family for 25 years. Just like The Wizard of Oz was every time The Wizard of Oz was on, it was time to do that. But I miss movies like that, although I have to tell you guys, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend the sequel to Gladiator. I think it's a very well done film, and it's loud, it's violent, but I thought it was terrific.
Steve, where did you see it? What theater?
I saw it at let's see, where did I see it? I saw it at I saw it at the Directors Guild with great sound. But as I've told everybody, my wife found it so loud that she put her hands over her ears for half the movie, and so violent that she put her hands over her eyes for half the movie. So my wife didn't see the movie.
I'll never go to any movie without a pair of earplugs because you never know.
Yes, the movies have gotten very, very noisy.
Well, there's so many kinds of, one of the things we haven't spoken about, of course, are the science fiction movies and how interesting that concept was, especially in the 50s and 60s, but right up till today. I mean, they're just films that were different and kind of scared us, certainly as kids. And but they also had a lot to say about, in essence, the Cold War. Often. Yeah.
I always
five words: the day the Earth stood still.
Great film.
Or three words: Klaatu Barada Nikto. But it's funny, Julian, having studied science fiction films for ages and having been a former writer for Cine Fantastique, science fiction movies for many years were considered B movies, with a few exceptions. I mean, MGM put some money into Forbidden Planet, Fox put some money into The Day the Earth Stood Still, but not until the mid-'60s, and then with Planet of the Apes being a big film for Fox, I think that's when it really started they started to realize that the kids would come out in droves to see movies, and then 9 years later you get Star Wars, which changed the parameters forever.
Well, so also in the 60s, you had all those kids, people who were kids in the early 50s are now adults, and they're going to see these movies, and they're taking their kids. So, there's kind of an acceleration there.
Sure.
A genre that had great movies, and still does when they get to it, Westerns. There were some great movies in the Western genre. Red River was always my favorite. I'm curious to know what you guys think. What are your thoughts?
Well, my favorite was High Noon, because not only was it a terrific Western, but it was taking on the McCarthy whole period without being known that it was taking it on the McCarthy period. So it was it had everything going for it, including Gary Cooper and, of course, Grace Kelly, even Kathy Jurado. Was that her name, guys?
Yes, Kathy Jurado. But Carl Foreman, who wrote it, said that it was the only thing he ever wrote that was a deliberate polemic. I mean, exactly what you said is the reason they made it.
The screenwriter, we're talking about High Noon?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Carl Foreman, the scriptwriter, was blacklisted.
Yes, he was. He had to go. He had to move to England.
Well, what happened was Stanley Kramer, who produced the movie, wanted to fire him because he was getting a lot of pressure from the studio and other people that he was hiring a communist. And Gary Cooper, who was not known to be liberal, went to Kramer and said, "If you get rid of Carl Foreman, I quit."
Cooper was conservative, but he wasn't a doctrinaire conservative. He wasn't like John Wayne.
That's right.
Much more low key.
Foreman. Speaking of Arthur's favorite, Bridge on the River Kwai, Carl Foreman co-wrote Bridge on the River Kwai with Michael Wilson, but both were blacklisted, and they ended up giving the credit to Pierre Boulle, who had written the original novel and who couldn't write in English. They ended up giving him the Oscar that year. So the
credits were eventually restored.
Finally restored. But I got to meet Carl Foreman. Carl Foreman came back strongly after the blacklist period and produced arguably one of the great World War II epics of the 60s in The Guns of Navarone, which is one of my personal favorites, even though it has a horrible model shot to start off the movie.
Another great genre, though, World War II movies. What a genre. Saving Private Ryan, Battleground, which is still my favorite. Richard mentioned a little movie before called Play Misty for Me. That is a little gem that never became a big hit. In the Western genre, there's a little movie called The Fastest Gun Alive with Glenn Ford. Not 3:10 to Yuma, which they remade, but The Fastest Gun Alive. Lee, do you know that movie?
I saw it on TCM fairly recently, and it's an amazingly entertaining movie.
It's a great little
really
movie.
Good.
You know?
I thought the original 3:10 to Yuma was one hell of a Western as well.
But we just realized how important the Western was to popular culture at the time. I mean, if even on TV, everything that was Gunsmoke, Wagon Train, Maverick. I mean, the Westerns were part of the fabric of our lives.
America loves Westerns, and if we mention Clint Eastwood as Richard did on Play Misty for Me, he made a little movie called The Unforgiven. One of the great movies of all time, won the Academy Award, I believe.
Yes, that year.
Well, you can also remember the man who became the biggest box office star for years in America, John Wayne, was made by Stagecoach. That's the movie that made his career, having made a million crappy movies, but then he teamed up with John Ford and his whole life changed.
And then he did The Searchers, which is a movie I will always stop and see whenever it's streaming. It's
Steve, have you seen the new restoration of The Searchers yet?
I have not. How is it?
I haven't seen it. I'm going to have to wait till to get the Blu-ray.
Have any of you guys ever met John Wayne in person?
No, I
did. I only saw him at the Beverly Wilshire as he lumbered by.
Well, I was with him and a couple of friends. It's a long story. I won't tell it. At the Polo Lounge at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And all I can tell you is when you meet John Wayne in person, you're looking at John Wayne and listening to him on the screen. He was exactly the same guy.
Wow.
The only thing he didn't say was Pilgrim.
Yeah.
I bet.
Let's talk about what we think are the greatest movies of all time. There's a subject. I mean, really, we all have opinions on that. Richard, let's go to you. Greatest movie of all time, in your opinion?
Well, I'd have to say, you guys might be a little conflicted about this one, but I think it's going to be the horror genre for what I feel like talking about right now, which is The Thing by John Carpenter, because it's a film that basically heightens the paranoia that we have, and I guess you could almost tie it back to a paranoia in the 50s, but it's kind of trying to figure out who is the thing, and maybe it's tied to the AIDS scare in the 80s. But it was great in the sense that, you just didn't know, this thing could look like anybody, it could be anybody. And it just had so many little details in it. And it's definitely among my top favorites.
A little black and white movie, a fantastic movie. Yes.
Well, no, he just mentioned.
No, Carpenter's movie was not a little black and white movie.
Well, they're both pretty good, though.
The Thing?
Yeah,
The Thing was black and white.
Well, no,
the original.
Richard, you're talking about the John Carpenter remake, right?
Yeah, I like the John Carpenter remake.
Forgive me.
But also the old one is good, too. Thing from Another World, because it's an outstanding picture as well. Yes.
Well, I think it's just a pointlessly open can of worms to imagine there is such a thing as the greatest film of all time. I mean,
but there is, in your opinion.
But even in opinion, it's just too subjective.
Well, it's something to discuss.
It's my mood from from moment to moment. I mean, the thing is, one of the things that should be looked at with any film is its ambitions versus what it achieves.
Correct.
You can have a film that isn't terribly ambitious that achieves roughly 100% of what the people making it set out to do, and there are other films that are far more ambitious that achieve only a percentage of what theoretically could have been achieved. And I think you have to look at every film through that lens to figure out what the abilities are of the people who made it.
I don't remember you chiming in on what your Desert Island movie is. What is your Desert Island movie?
No, I said it was Patton.
Oh, it is Patton. Okay, okay.
Well, it also depends on the genre. I mean, you can't kind of put and just say, "Well, this is the best movie."
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
So,
but as a subjective question, if someone put a gun to your head, and irrespective of genre, and said, "What do you believe? You, not the world, not the AFI, but what do you believe is the greatest movie of all time?"
I believe they should take the gun off my head.
Well, but they're not going to take the gun off your head. They're going to ask you the question.
And I'm just going to get shot.
I don't think I can be shot by saying that the first Godfather movie has to be probably in the top 5 of all time.
Without question.
Yeah. I mean, it's a movie that plays and plays. And even though the second one is equally good in many ways, there's just something about the first one that, considering the trouble that it had in getting off the ground, that nobody wanted to work with Marlon Brando. He was considered poison at the box office. Nobody wanted this upstart kid named Al Pacino. And Francis Ford Coppola was being threatened with being fired every other week. It's amazing how, under great stress, brilliance emerges.
That came out. Lee, if the gun was to your head, what would you choose?
We've talked about this before, and I grew up learning to buy and appreciate silent films. So I would choose, if I had the gun to my head, is D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, which has 4 different stories, all told separately at the beginning. And then as the movie goes on, they intercut. They each have their own climax. And it's a movie that has the spectacle, it has the historical film, it has the religious film, and it has a modern story. It's just amazing, but it's really hard to get people to sit and watch silent movies nowadays. So I'm going to be probably alone in my picking a silent film as the greatest film ever made. Again, with the kind of caveats that we've said, God forbid that we have to make that kind of decision, but we do it only amongst ourselves.
Right.
Today with hypothetical.
Well, but the question is, I mean, is a film great because of what's actually in the film, or is it great because of the effect it has on an audience?
No, it's great because it's great because of what you think of it. It's a subjective question. It has nothing to do with these other things. It's just, what do you think is the greatest film ever made?
But I'm an audience of one. I mean, but that's just it. I mean, I'm an audience of one. The film has an effect on me, but it may not have an effect on me because it's so great. It may just have an effect on me because there's a meshing of sensibilities there.
I know people that don't respond to Citizen Kane, which is frequently cited as the greatest film ever made. I've talked to people that have seen it today and say, "What's the big deal?" So.
Well, when people talk about Kane and they wax poetic about how great it is and the various elements, no one ever says about Kane is how damned entertaining it is. I find it just an enormously entertaining movie, and it never flags. I mean, there's always interest, not just visually, but it's interesting textually. The performances are uniformly wonderful. It has a great sense of what it wants to be.
One of the ways one could judge a movie is how you go in and how you leave. In other words, how has that movie affected you? And that can be in so many different ways. And I think that's what one would hope to get out of a really good film, the fact that something changed within yourself.
In a way, you're saying what I've been thought for many years is that how you react to a movie while you're watching it, in the end, is less important than how you remember it.
That's right.
Because I forget which mogul it was. I mean, for the sake of argument, let's say it was Sam Goldwyn. He said one of the great things about being in the movie business is that at the end of the day, you really haven't given your audience anything. You have a print of a film, and you show it to them, and they pay you money to see it, and at the end of the day, you lock it up, and the print is still yours. I mean, you haven't given them anything tangible, but you've given them memories. And whether you think a movie is great or you hate it or whatever, it's how you want. And one of the reasons blockbuster films become blockbusters is because people, after they've seen the movie, they say to their friends, "Go see this movie." Word of mouth is very, very important with a movie.
Word of mouth is everything in entertainment. Everything.
Exactly. And in fact, going back to an earlier part of the conversation, I at one point I wanted to say that in the last 10 years, there were only 2 films in which I said to people, "Go out and see this movie." Virtually nothing else I saw. What? The first one was The Imitation Game.
What were those 2 films?
Benedict Cumberbatch as
what were those 2
Alan
films?
Turing, and the breaking the
code.
The Enigma code,
right?
German's Enigma code. While at the same time, it had this parallel story about him being a closeted gay man in a country where it was criminal offense to be gay. And the other one was a film called Loving Vincent. And it was about people gathering in Arles after the death of Vincent van Gogh to figure out how he died. Did he commit suicide? I mean, did he commit suicide, or was he actually murdered? And it's all done in the form of his paintings. So everything is layered over with in the style of Vincent van Gogh's paintings. And what makes the film so interesting is that the actors, they're robbed of their facial expressions because they're hidden behind these paintings. So the writing and the performances have to be exceptionally good to transmit the feeling that the film is trying, and it manages to do that.
Richard, would you stay with Goodfellas as the greatest movie you believe of all time?
No, sir. I'm going to lean towards Spartacus.
Ah.
I like Spartacus a lot. I like the epic of Spartacus. I like the presentation of Spartacus. The idea of having the movie be a presentation. I'm seeing it in the movie theater. So when you go to have it as an experience, you're listening to the overture when the film begins. You're in the intermission. You're in the end. You're on a journey with Spartacus. I believe that is it for me. Yeah.
And it's got one of the great scores of all time.
Incredible. Yeah, incredible.
Although, actually, the film is called Spartacus, but it's not really about Spartacus. I mean, it's about how he molded a bunch of men who were only interested in gaining revenge on the people who had enslaved them and made them fight as gladiators, who just want to escape from Italy. And he says to them, you could do that, or you could become an army of gladiators and free every slave in Italy. And at the end, of course, I mean, is when their army has finally been defeated, and they're sitting in a field, and they're being offered their lives. They'll just turn over Spartacus to Crassus, and to a man they rise up and they all claim to be Spartacus, which of course is the most moving moment.
I am Spartacus,
and it's his men's journey. It's not his.
Steve, what is your favorite James Bond movie?
I think the greatest James Bond movie is a tie between the third film, Goldfinger, and the more recent first of the Daniel Craig's, Casino Royale. I think both those movies deliver on very high levels, although the underrated Bond movie, which we talked about a few weeks ago when we did our night of underrated movies, was the one movie that George Lazenby played James Bond, the Australian actor, called On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which if you look at the litany of Bond movies, and there have been 25 official and 27 if you count the two outliers, is the most carefully produced of all the Bond movies because Peter Hunt, who had edited the first 5 Bond movies, was given his opportunity to direct, and he poured himself into that movie.
It's my favorite Bond film, in spite of the fact that I do not like Lazenby at all.
Okay, well, there you go. But I will still argue that given that he had no acting experience whatsoever, he plays it very comfortably and delivered about as best a performance as he could. And
a funny bit of trivia is that there's a Power of Film on, I believe it's TCM, might be Netflix, I'm not sure. But
it's TCM.
I'm talking about the part where the person speaking about this movie, about Goldfinger, and talked about Lottie Lenya. Oh, is that From Russia with Love?
That's Russia with Love.
That's Russia with Love.
Said that Lottie Lenya on the set was fucking everybody. She's 80 years old. She get me a grip, bring in somebody. She was a sex maniac in real life, married to Kurt Weill, no?
Well, it's funny you should mention that because when I worked on the first 3 Laserdisc releases of the James Bond movies, Terrence Young, the director, literally said what you just said, that Alana Lenya was in her 70s, but she was still screwing like a banshee. Yes. And they forgot to ask Cubby Broccoli's permission to bring out these soundtracks as a second soundtrack. So when he heard it for the first time, he was furious, and they all had to be recalled because that would have never been got out.
Steve, I heard it on you. You did that. Wasn't that from... I saw it. It was great.
That was my posting.
That was great.
No, I actually was the commentator on those discs, and I got fired because they forgot to get permissions.
I've got the laser disc with your commentary on it, Steve.
Oh, thank you for preserving that. It's
outstanding. Yeah.
We were recording that in a studio on Pacific Coast Highway when somebody knocked on the door and said, "Come on downstairs. The war with Iraq has begun." And we're watching all these anti-aircraft fireballs into the sky and everything. It was crazy.
Before we leave this subject, let's talk in terms of a performance that really affected you. A male or female performance in any movie
great question
that you thought was really something.
Go first.
Lee, you're pretty good at this. What do you think?
Oh gosh, can someone else go first? I can't come up with one right off the bat, but I will.
I can go
ahead, Richard.
Go with you.
Harrison Ford, Indiana Jones.
Okay.
Interesting choice.
First one. Raiders of the Lost Ark. He's incredible in it.
It's certainly memorable, that's for sure.
And he almost didn't get the role because Tom Selleck was paged to play him, but he couldn't get out of his Magnum PI contract.
I think that Jack Nicholson has had so many memorable films, but I think A Few Good Men was one of the most extraordinary performances I've ever seen. Having been in the armed forces and having met people like that, it was just sensational.
Just that soliloquy, Julian, just that soliloquy alone. Wow.
By the way, you know who did it on stage, guys?
What?
Who did Nicholson's role?
Stephen Lang. Stephen Lang played.
Really?
Yeah. And the other film for Nicholson, of course, is Chinatown. You know, he's just extraordinary in that. But you've got Cuckoo's Nest. You've got so many films that man did, including playing Eugene O'Neill in Reds, and brilliantly. His daughter, O'Neill's daughter, thanked him for how much she felt he captured Eugene O'Neill.
No, he was original.
I will tell you my favorite Nicholson performance among the many that you've mentioned, Julian. His Last Detail,
Bob Town.
I think he's amazing in that film, and it's a heartbreaking film. It's got one of the greatest scripts ever written by Robert Towne, and I just adore the movie. I think it's really, really
Arthur,
good.
how about you? You've got a lot of guys you like.
Well, just so many great performances. Wow. What comes to my mind immediately, for some reason, is one of my favorite little movies of all time, and that's 12 Angry Men, and the performance of Lee J. Cobb was overwhelming, I thought. What a movie that was. But there's so many, gee, hard to argue with a soliloquy like Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men. That was really about as good as it's going to get.
You can't handle the truth.
That's right.
I think that the cast of The Best Years of Our Lives, starting with Frederick March, and then going to Dana Andrews and Harold Russell and Myrna Loy, just Teresa Wright, just flawless cast, and just so memorable. But being a big Steve McQueen fan, I always point out to the movie that doesn't get mentioned enough, which is Robert Wise's The Sand Pebbles, 1966, was the first time he was ever nominated for an Oscar, and he lost to Paul Scofield, A Man for All Seasons that year, which is another extraordinary performance. But McQueen is marvelous, but I think he was perceived of as a pretty face and not a great actor, which is unfortunate.
The three performances that stick in my mind, three greatest performances, are Henry Fonda in The Grapes of Wrath, Ralph Richardson in The Heiress, and Judi Dench in Her Majesty Mrs. Brown.
Interesting.
I think we can't in any way forget Edward G. Robinson in Double Indemnity.
Oh.
Yeah, he's wonderful in that film. Because his character Keyes is the moral center of the movie.
Yes, he sure is.
And he's absolutely critical to it. That's one of the reasons why Body Heat is such a pale imitation of it, because there's no moral center to it. But and of course that speech he makes about all the ways that people can die. It's just, but he was never even nominated for an Oscar in his entire.
Well, you're forgetting Mo Howard in The Three Stooges Meet Hercules. Come on, guys.
Isn't that the one you're taking to the desert island?
Yes.
Hey, it's the only movie that opens with the title credit, filmed in glorious black and white.
You guys ever see a little movie called Quiz Show?
Oh yeah.
Yes, you worked on it.
So subtle, but just perfect.
And Schofield in that small but incredible role in Quiz Show, where he plays
his father.
Yeah. Also, as somebody said, in The Man for All Seasons, but he had done that on stage for so many years that he knew it inside and out.
But how about Schofield in a little movie called The Train?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there's a movie never mentioned on any list.
John Frankenheimer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would I would categorize that and a little World War II movie called The Hill that Sidney Lumet did that I think nobody's seen them, and they're great movies. They're really, really good.
Connery and Lumet is that's maybe the greatest actor-director collaboration that nobody knows about.
I don't think anybody here probably has ever seen The Offense, that Sean Connery played a molester, child molester in that.
Again, with Lumet, directed.
With Lumet. That's
was that one of those two movies that UA financed because they got him to play Bond one more time? Because I know he got a 2-picture deal with him.
I would imagine that would be the only way.
That sounds right.
Yeah, because he didn't want to come back and do Diamonds Are Forever, and I think David Picker offered him a 2-picture deal. I think that may have been one of them because he
a breakthrough movie that we haven't discussed it tonight or today is Midnight Cowboy. Schlesinger, Dustin Hoffman, John Voight. I have a personal experience with that film. I worked for United Artists at the time. I went to a screening in New York in a 50-seat screening room, and when I got there, it was they were about to start it. There was one seat available, and it was in the second row, and it was right next to a 19-year-old Liza Minnelli, who was in Flora the Red Menace at the time. And this was about 2 weeks before the movie was released, but there was a lot of buzz on it. And so the movie starts, and as soon as the drive-in screen comes up and you hear Nielsen singing Everybody's Talking, I mean, she hits my arm. Did you see that? She says to me, and hits my arm. Easy, take it easy. By the time that movie was finished, my arm was black and blue because there were so many scenes that she was, look at that. Look, she was so, out there with this movie. This was a breakthrough great movie. Dark did much more business than people thought at the time. It was made for $3 million, but Jerry Hellman was producer. Grossed $35 million in 1969. Big hit.
I was happy to have launched that at the Coronet Theater in New York City. And in those days, can you imagine, it played 1 year. 1 year before it went out to the neighborhoods. Never happened today.
1969, right?
Never happened today. Nope.
It won the Oscar.
And
everything is
an X-rated movie.
Yeah.
Let's remember, an X-rated movie. So,
which it wouldn't be now.
No,
probably be a PG. Probably a PG now.
PG-13.
Wouldn't go that far.
No, not that far.
It's funny because gay culture was relatively unknown to the mass audience, and there were things brought out that were. I mean, it was very soft pedal that John Voight's character Joe Buck worked both ways.
That's right. Well, you have to get some way to make a buck.
Well, they painted it also dark, though. You see, it was just. I read somewhere where John Schlesinger, he didn't like the movie when it was finished. He didn't think it was going to do business. I guess that happens too, doesn't it? Great directors. But it was a great film.
Another Dustin Hoffman performance that stands out for me is Rain Man, which I thought was just a brilliant movie and a very underrated Tom Cruise performance as well as his brother. Tom Cruise, to me, who's perceived today as an action star because of all the Mission Impossible movies, but when he wants to act, he can do a really good job. He gets a lot of negative publicity about his Scientology beliefs, but as an actor, he's pretty damn good.
Well, A Few Good Men, he was great in that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what Dustin said about Cruise in that movie was that he said, look what he had to do. He said, I had the showy part, but he had to carry the movie in many ways because that was true. And Dustin said he's going to be a huge movie star. And of course, he became even bigger than we thought.
Sure.
But we were talking about Eastwood earlier, and I was lucky enough to become friends with Dory Sherry. And he was in the hospital, and I would visit him constantly only because my father was in the same hospital. But I didn't tell Dory that. So he was shocked that I was coming so often to see him. And he said to me, have you seen the movie Outlaw Josie Wales? And I said, no, I really haven't. He said, look, I'm going to tell you something. That guy, Eastwood, is going to be a huge director. If I was running a studio, I'd sign him up right now And I always remembered that he saw in Eastwood on Play Misty, for me, we talked about, but even in Josie Wales, he knew at that point. So
getting back to Tom Cruise for a moment, he's always reminded me of Tyrone Power.
Who did, Avi?
Cruise has always reminded me of Tyrone Power. That's the good news. The bad news is I've always found Tyrone Power to be a rather insincere actor. And I kind of have the same feeling about Cruise.
Well,
how do you feel about his performance in Nightmare Alley?
That's the funny thing about I find Power a very enjoyable actor to watch. Even while I don't find him all that, he was kind of an actorly actor. In his contemporary though, Errol Flynn, I love Flynn. I love Flynn in everything. And the thing is, of course, Flynn had this deserved reputation as a real rake, and he had the rape trial and all that stuff.
See Tyrone Power and witness for the prosecution, Avi?
Yeah. He's the same in that film that I don't really buy what he's selling. I mean, it's a wonderful movie in so many ways, but Power, I don't say how anybody watch that movie and not know that Leonard Vole is guilty, because he just doesn't. His protestations just don't.
All I got to say is Mark Azzaro, end of story. He's one.
Oh no! I love the. But the thing is that Flynn, for all his faults as a human being, had this kind of sweet sincerity in his performance.
Well, you want to talk about witness for the prosecution? How about Charles Lawton role in that?
Oh, he's great.
I mean,
he's wonderful.
Now we're talking about acting. Now
Julian, you ask actors, the greatest movie actors of all time, his name always comes up.
Yeah,
Charles Lawton.
He was something. He was even Cooley in Advise and Consent.
Like, he only directed one movie.
Yeah, but a hell of a movie.
Night of the Hunter, with a very ominous and horrifying Robert Mitchum. Whoa!
And Lillian Gish, whom I met. But it's a wonderfully stylish film. I mean, visually, it's also just very, very striking.
It's interesting that Richard brings up memorable performances. Harrison Ford in Indiana Jones. One thing you have to say is that he was probably as perfect a cast in that role as anybody that's ever been in movies. Harrison Ford was Indiana Jones. He was perfect.
It's a character based not in a small way on Charlton Heston's character in a film called Secret of the Incas. He plays an adventurer called Harry Steele, dressed exactly the same, with the same laconic delivery. And Lucas and Spielberg, certainly knew that.
Milton Berle called Charlton Heston the greatest loincloth actor of all time.
Of course, Berle needed a bigger loincloth than most people.
I was watching... Very funny, Avi. I was watching Ben-Hur last night, the rowing sequence. And after you watch Charlton Heston row for about 20 minutes, even your arms are tired. And as the story goes, William Wyler liked multiple takes. And I think he really worked those actors in that series. And by the way, getting back to one of my all-time favorites, The Three Stooges Meet Hercules, they spoofed that very nicely in the Three Stooges movie, because Skyler, their friend, who's trying to build up his biceps, is working one side of the boat by himself, where 20 rowers are on the other side working it as he's building up one bicep. Then to build up the other bicep, they move the guys over to the other side. It's a very classic moment in cinema.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought it up, Steve, because it really would have felt awful if we hadn't talked that out. But
Steve, the Three Stooges are perhaps the most profitable movie guys that ever lived. The movies were made for $1.42, and they all did well and are still playing.
Well, exactly.
Harry Cohn loved them.
And we haven't talked much about comedy, because comedy somewhat, as I say every week, has disappeared from the box office. But, I think that the idea of going to a movie theater and just laughing your head off for 2 hours or whatever is still one of the great fun experiences. And even though Avi and I have talked to death about how he hates it's a mad world, I love It's a Mad World because of the amount of stars I get to see. It's
very entertaining,
very funny, very entertaining.
Richard, of the 1980s or 90s, what would you say is the funniest film you've ever seen?
I would have to put airplane. I would put Airplane up there, the original Airplane.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, Airplane's got to be number one in my book because it was such an edgy film in terms of taking the most dramatic pictures that are made and making them comical. And what can I say? Don't call me Shirley.
Well, I must say that Peter Falk and Alan Arkin in The In-Laws has to be one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. And it's
Serpentine.
That's Serpentine. That's right.
Well, I want to add one more film to that, but it's a little older, The Odd Couple, because I just think that's comic genius. I know it's not in the 80s and 90s, but The Odd Couple with Lemon and Mathauer is just an incredible picture to watch. And I just think it's fantastic and definitely up there for comedy.
Some Like It Hot, anybody?
Oh, yeah.
Some Like It Hot is a very, very funny movie, and it does exactly what it was meant to. But in many ways, it was the worst thing that ever happened to Billy Wilder's career. Because the film was so successful, from that point on, he was being perceived as a comedy director. And so all the great dramas he made, all of which were wickedly funny in their own way, the studio now wanted him to make comedies, which I always felt were kind of beneath him. I mean, he was not at the top of his game when he was making comedies.
Robbie, I think Irma La Deuce outgrossed Something Like It Hot.
Irma La Deuce is the most successful film Wilder ever made, and every film he made thereafter lost money.
It's funny. The movie that follows Some Like It Hot, The Apartment, is, I think some people perceive it as a comedy, but it really isn't. It's a
great movie.
It's more, I would even say lightly to be a dramedy, but it's pretty dramatic, etc. But I love Wilder. In fact, Stalag 17, another film we haven't talked about, to me is one of the great war movies of all time.
Another funny movie was De Niro and Charles Grodin in Midnight Run.
Yes.
Really terrific film, and a lot of laughs, and holds up if you're going to comedy. Comedy, as Steve points out, we don't see them anymore, and even when we did, most of them fell on their ass. But a couple of times you'd really laugh, and there's nothing better than to be in a movie theater with an audience laughing. That really does work.
Without question.
Great choice.
Young Frankenstein.
One of my unforgettable movie-going comedic,
the
not only really funny, but
that's
really
Frankenstein to you, Arthur.
And really, really, really feeling.
Of Mel Brooks' films, I like The Producers best.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brooks' films fall into two categories. There are the two roughly original films, The Producers and The 12 Chairs, and then there are the movies that are spoofs of genres, which is like just about everything else, with the exception of Life Stinks. And
which, by the way, is one of the worst titles of all time.
Well, it is, and although it should be shown on a double bill with Life is Beautiful.
No, the interesting thing about The Producers was that it was 88 minutes, and that's generally what you should do. You better make your comedy 90, 95 minutes.
I agree.
Hard to keep an audience after that.
I agree. But it's true of every movie. I mean, every movie will eventually wear out its welcome, and you really have to figure out where that point is.
Arthur Penn once said, there isn't a movie or a play that couldn't be done in 25 to 30 minutes.
As a rule these days, every action movie is 20 minutes too long. It's just, they just go over and over. Of course, we're seeing a lot of the same action that we always see. For a time there, I was going to see trailers between first-run movies, and every trailer was a post-apocalyptic end-of-the-world story. I mean, how many times can you blow up the world? Come on.
Well, that's why goes to why movies are so long now, because of the ease of electronic editing. All their worst ideas can be.
Absolutely true. They try editing scenarios that you would never try if you had to physically handle film, but because most of them are dead ends, they're rabbit holes. Yeah. But not just that, is that they have all this coverage and they put it in the movie, and they think this quick cutting makes the movie play faster, but in fact it's just the opposite. It attenuates it and makes it play slower.
Well, we have come to the end of this marvelous roundtable. I want to thank Richard and Avi and Lee for joining us. I thought we had a nice spirited discussion about so many movie topics. I'm now going to turn it over to our maestro, our producer, our chief cook and bottle washer, Mr. Mike Faber.
Thanks, Steve. You've reached the end of this episode of the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this without you. We want to hear from you, so please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Remember, you could also find us wherever fine podcasts are found, and now you can even find us up on our YouTube channel. If you made it this far into this episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? Or if you're listening to us, please give us 5 stars. If you're into social media, check us out on Instagram and on Facebook. Before we get out of here, let's check with the guys and see what's happening this week on their podcasts. Julian, who are you talking to this week?
This week is Roseanne Barr, a woman who was certainly controversial, outspoken, and I will say this, when you hear her story of car accidents, brain damage, mental institutions, etc., it's quite a story how this woman who came from really a Mormon state was able to forge an incredible television show that was still probably one of the most successful shows that were ever put on TV, taking on social issues, yet in a comic way.
Steve, what's cooking over on Saturday night at the movies?
I was walking my dog the other day, and I bumped into a producer named Mark Rosen, who works in both features and television, used to be a partner of Linda Ops, the producer, and we get to talk the business about trends and what's going on in producing this week on Saturday night at the movies.
Awesome. On behalf of Steve, Arthur, and Julian, thanks again for listening. This is your producer and announcer, Mike Faber. We'll see you here next time on Tales from Hollywoodland. Your Hollywood adventure starts right here.
Drew Leiter here. Wish you could keep up on DC Comics but don't have the time or the money? Not a problem. Join Cletus Jacobs and I as we bring you recaps and commentary on DC Comics, television, movies, and more, whether they are good or not. The Earth Station DCU podcast comes out weekly and is part of the ESO Network.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.